Okay.
All right, thank you for coming to Mel Talks tonight. Our speaker, Mark Callaghan, will start here in just a minute. We're almost at the end of our season. We've got next week is a special Zoom-only meeting. You can find information about that on the Mel website. It's Alma, Joran, and her husband, Stephen Burke, talking about archaeology. We have some history coming up, a lecture on the stainless steel and stainless beads. And finally, another artist, David Aldrich, will talk about his career in art, and that'll be our final presentation for this season on April the 6th. Mark is here to talk about his life here since 1970. Hardly there's even a city here then, but yes, there was. And afterwards, we'll have an opportunity for questions. Mark, please go ahead.
Okay, Scott, thank you very much. Yeah, thanks for coming this evening. I'm hoping that it's very nice also that Scott is taping this also, so some people can see this at a later time. I understand that the library will do that, and that's a wonderful thing too. Thanks for coming, and basically, Scott has asked me to talk about my time in Yucatan. As I mentioned, my brother that's here with us, James, and my mother, that's no longer with us. We came in 1970 to Yucatan from San Diego. And part of the idea was to get at a distance from a war we were interested in, the Vietnam War. And so we stayed, and we loved it, and we still love it. We love Yucatan. And my wife is back here, Yoli, and we work together in a paper business, and we've had for about 27 years, and very, very interested in that. But what I'm going to be talking tonight is about my history as an artist, as a painter, printmaker, and papermaker. So that begins with studying with a local artist, Ermilo Torre Gamboa, that actually was about 99 and passed away last year. But he was a great artist. You might have seen some of his artwork. And so some of this work is inspired, of course, by, Yoli, what are you trying to tell me? No te oigo. Debajo. Entonces más de. Okay. ¿Así está bien? Okay. So these are mostly paintings. I began to study with oils, and I'm sorry, these were slides from almost 50 years ago, and they got some fungus on them. I never really did Photoshop, so I'm sorry that they don't look so great, but there's just to give you an idea of my earliest paintings, my first art show. And I traveled into the haciendas back then. It was still, most of them were very active, and did drawings of people, and the machine house is still working, producing a lot of Henneken. And I'm fascinated by the people here, of course. Coming from, California, being here is actually a different culture, and I love the faces and the expressions. So this is part of my first show. It was about 1974, 75 in the Benjamin Franklin English School. They had a gallery. There weren't a lot of galleries back there in Merida, so they had a gallery.
Was you shot here then?
No, this wasn't here. We got here in 1982 at this place, so I'll talk about that later. This was, there was someone that rented out. So this just comes as, the things that attracted me back then, the little house, and some of the architectural structures I was really attracted to, and the orange, warm skies when they would burn the fields for the growing, slashing burning for growing up corn again every year. It's an old Mayan tradition. Always had very red and orange skies during April and May, and I was very attracted by that. And this was a church, a Gothic church, San Ignacio. It was on the road toward Rezo. Fascinating. It was fascinating. There was like San Ignacio, Ecnacan, and Olvido here in Merida, with the three Gothic churches I found in Yucatan, and I found them quite attractive for something was European. And this was oil paint. And this is an archway of mache. That's also important for us. So these are just, basic structures of architectural things that I was attracted to. And Yashikukuil, which is now a museum. Uchichen, which is a hacienda just south of Merida, on the Periférico. And this is the other one I was attracted to, Callaghan, which is on the way to the famous cenotes now that you've probably all gone to. You go past Akan Cave, you will end up at some cenotes by just reach a little Chucanan, but now it's there's a whole group of the ring of cenotes is very famous now. Anyway, this is on the way, and you'll see that if you go down there. And this is a very interesting part of a church that's left in James, goes by all the time, because this is on the way to where he works in the southern cone of the peninsula, Kashikiwik. There's a reserve that he works at, he's director of. And this is his shul, also very fascinating, these remnants. But also what fascinating was me the fact that, these were plants growing on them, and you have the law of entropy happening. And I think that's what attracted me quite a bit. And this was like, this is a place on the way to Campeche where they were all actually Mayan tombs, Chuchumil. And so these are mounds where they buried their Mayans buried their ancient ones, the dead. And I was attracted to that because, Yucatan is a rock. There's not a lot of soil here, unless you go really south where there's accumulation of soil. But most of it's just rock. So that's why we call it the rock. And you have it really buried on top of the rock and built up. That's why this is an interesting thing. This is a tree that came out of a Mayan ruin in Mayapan. There you go, Mayapan. And so these were part of my first exhibition in the early 70s. So now I decided to move more into drawing, more into black and white. And I went to Mexico City. I studied in Escuela, the National School of Painting and Sculpting, came back to Merida, continued painting and drawing. And I went to San Miguel de Allende on the recommendation of my maestro, my teacher, Ermilo Torre. So I decided to share some of the drawings with you just to give you an idea of what I was up to. And in San Miguel, I studied Instituto Allende. I studied a BFA in arts, and I also ended up teaching drawing at the Bellas Artes School. So this is an early self-portrait. And when I taught drawing, it was pretty much life drawing, so we had a lot of models, and some of these are examples of that. And I did landscapes to it. It's high desert. I don't know if you've been to San Miguel or Guanajuato area. It's very beautiful. So lived there from 78 to 82. And I was also attracted to chiaroscuro, inspired by Rembrandt and Callaghan quite a bit. And gestural drawing. And I taught drawing, and so I did a lot of drawing here. So drawing brought me more towards movement and my interest in kinetic artwork. Reminded me of Marcel Duchamp, and we were descending the stairway. It's also a great inspiration in the Italian futurists like Giacomo Valli, and all that were working with movement. I've always been attracted with movement, kinetic artwork. So part of the exercises I would put for my students would also be moving the sequences, having to model moving sequences. So drawing's a great fundamental thing, as we all know. I love it, and it does give you a great idea of the sensation of movement of things. And permits you to have the structure of whatever you want to do, sculpture or painting. But I love digital drawing like this, where you actually, in 30 seconds, just kind of compose something quickly. Not even a composition, it's just a pull together of some kind of movement thing. Buenas noches. Hi. How you doing? Hello. So these are more of the drawings from San Miguel de Allende, and we have all kinds of fascinating models, you know. The type of the Yaño or to be indigenous folk areas is fascinating. I have a comadre that is Yaño Otomi, and an American friend of mine, and he's a professor teacher from Guanajuato. And it's part of the culture there, as we have the Mayan Paper culture here. It's very, very interesting features, fascinating faces, fascinating figures. And so, from the more colorful stuff, I went more and more toward black and white drawing, and went toward printmaking. In the Instituto Allende, where I studied, I really was not working with color for quite a while. For about 3 or 4 years, I dedicated more time to drawing black and white figures that you saw and landscapes, and I went into etching and lithography, traditional lithography and etching. This is a aqua tinta with dry point. And this, again, is an etching. This is a large etching, and it is an attempt to convey movement of a dancer leaping. So again, my interest in movement, kinetic artwork. This is a lithography, and lithography, it's a different matter. It's very, very interesting. Use ink and crayon. It's all about ink and water, acid and water. And it's a very large stone, lithographic stone from Bavaria. And some of you know what lithography is about, but this is a litho, a very large one. And this is another etching. Just a few examples of these. I did many more, but just a few examples. So, after San Miguel, I came back to Merida in 82. In 1982, I was living in the Quartermex area, where the Siglo XX is, the Maya Museum, and I didn't have enough space for a studio, so I got together with a couple of the artists who rented this place out in 1982. It was known as Escultura back then, and we formed an association of 18 artists, and called AVIAC, it was an association of artists. We had a gallery in this whole area. We had big happenings here. It was a lot of fun. So I taught drawing and silkscreen. My silkscreen studio was mounted against this wall here, and I taught drawing, and I did my paintings in the second room of the library. And Alonso Gutierrez taught painting, and Victor Rendon taught photography. We did a show here of our work about, 4 years ago, 5 years ago. They invited us to the show. Anyway, so I began doing some of this work that was influenced by etching, by the printmaking that I had done in San Miguel de Allende. It was much more toned down, the colors were much more toned down. Inspired by that, inspired by going back into a plate where it's dark and you burnish out the lights. And if you know anything about etching, you know that there's a way to lighten things up when they're dark. And I was doing that with this. I was sanding into the textures I was creating with pencil. And so this again is the same tree you saw in an earlier show of the Maya Pond. And interesting enough, this tree turned out to be the paper tree. This is the HUUN tree. In ancient Mayan means paper tree. And that's where they made paper form. It's a Ficus catidifolio, Ficus padifolia. It's a tree that was here before the Spanish came here, and they used the inner bark of those trees for their paper making in ancient times. And so, yeah, some of these are combination of water, color, and compressed charcoal, and red sanguine. Some of these, the haciendas that have been still in this kind of, were abandoned. In this one, this is by Simpach, and it still had the wheel to spin the rope with the string they were making. And it was later ripped off by some people because people stole things. There was nobody to take care of the place. But I found it quite interesting as a composition. And more and more abandoned places I was finding again, and Henneken fields not really being used anymore. Again, finding the spinning wheels of watercolor. This is was a Timosun Sur. This hacienda back then was owned by a friend's father, but this has become a very big hotel now. You've probably seen Timosun, one of the Hermanos hotels. Very fancy. But back then it was pretty much abandoned, but we went to the cenote that the guy knew about. So I took some images there, some paintings, all very figurative. And these are the wheels that they used to move the Henneken from place to place to cut Henneken's leaves. More traditional compositions, stacks of Henneken leaves. And this is a place by Concal, after Sipal, Santa Rosa Ishid or something, and it was a beautiful corrugating machine house. And of course, I was always been attracted to architecture, drawing architecture, and the drawing racks for the fiber on the outside. This is pastel. So, after a series of those, as I was going to the Caribbean quite a bit and had a friend there, and we were doing some diving, and I was getting excited about all the light and the colors of coral. And, the Caribbean is a very inspiring place. I got quite inspired, and I changed from a darkish way of approaching life and painting to much brighter realities. This is one of my favorite pieces that has to do with ocean water, movement, and birds. It's called Free Birds in the Sea. And actually, I painted this here too. It's here in this studio. Using some figurative with the cenote approach. This is a commission. And using elements from the coast, greenish water, and hurricanes and things, but in an attempt to express movement of wind. I've always been keen on movement of wind, air, light. And rain, trying to express things in movement, air, water, rain, in a relationship with nature. This is called Dream of a Cenote, and it's talking about attempting to express in a dream you can be above water and below water at the same time. So the division between above and below is not quite clear here. And these works were all done on either paper or cloth, and I prepared special gesso, we call it gesso, and prepared with glue and white powder, and prepare your own texture, and there's many ways to texture. And I was starting to roll shells and coral and different things into it, and getting some kind of effects. And here you can see a little bit more effects. I'm actually working with the subject matter of coral. And then I was doing larger pieces and then moving toward working on attempting to express the movement of fish and water movement in light mixed with coral. And enjoying this type of thing. And I'm using a lot of the textures from shells and coral down below. But although it's interesting in texture, I wasn't controlling the texture as much as I really wanted to. So this kept pushing me toward control of texture control. But I was enjoying the color. So one thing led to the other, and I continued to move. I was using acrylics on this gesso texture, but using it pretty much as you paint watercolors. The difference is with acrylic, you can use a retarder medium that permits you to use it as a watercolor or as an oil, and at the same time, you can leave the white space white like we do in watercolor. But if you want to layer, you can layer. You can't do in watercolor because it will lift up the water. And this becomes permanent once it dries. So all this kind of took me to another direction. I said, I really want to control texture. So I did. I took a piece of plasticine and I rolled that shells and I said, I want more control. So I made this small piece, just one thing, and I thought, well, okay, I have it. It's just a small piece, but I have it. So I went to Mexico City. I was invited to a show in the university with a couple other Yucatecan artists, Gonzalez and Rosais, and I took those pieces I just showed you with this in the end. And I was there, and I went to visit a friend, and Alejandro Ehrenberg, we had studied together in San Miguel de Allende, and he invited me to come to his workshop in Mexico City, and so I did, and he came to the show and looked at it, and I thought, I'd really like to do something in printmaking. And he said, well, maybe in my shop you can do it. So I began a whole new direction of printmaking called plastigraphy and hand papermaking in his shop in 1984 in Artegrafias Limitadas with Alejandro Ehrenberg, master printmaker. Now he was working with many of the greatest artists in Mexico at the time, Los Castro Miel, Magali Lara, Jose Luis Cuevas, I'm sure a lot of them know Jose Luis Cuevas, and many other artists. But I had the opportunity to make paper recycling arches, pieces of arches that were left over, which happens a lot in a workshop. They cut out pieces because it's too big. And so I recycled a lot of that, and I made my own batting screen, made paper, and I made my own plates out of the same material that I just showed you back here. That same material, instead of as a painting, I used it as a plate and did this. And this was a print called a plastigraphy, or plastigraphia. And I had to print it on 3 levels, and I had to use the hands for rolling too. Instead of a roller, I used part of the hands. So it was a very tedious printing process I developed with Alejandro called plastigraphia. And this was based on many interesting textures I found on a trip to Puebla where they make that mate paper. He was buying the mate paper for a series of art. And it had ammonite, ancient fossils, it has wheat textures, and on the upper part it has tools and man-made forms and shapes. So it's a combination of organic shapes in the lower part and man-made shapes in the upper part, and it's called Mundos en Conflicto, Worlds in Conflict. I was talking about the conflict of the organic world and the man-made world. So I did a few plastigraphias and came back to Merida, gave me a book on, hey, you can do paper out of these things, and I started researching with a friend from the CC, and I started making paper out of the ceiba tree with kapok and sansevieria, mother-in-law's tongue, and this was one of the plates I did in Merida, based on the house in downtown. This was called Casa de Luna, House of the Moon, and just with brown ink, and I would do a version with colored ink too. The same plate. It's the same plate. Casa de Luna. And here I'm talking about, I'm attempting to express elements of the ancient city of Merida that's buried beneath our city. In other words, it's one culture on top of the other as it goes. Just like in the ancient pyramids of the Mayans and many Mexicans that they continue to construct. Like in the pyramid of Chichen Itza, it has at least 3 levels of pyramids. The ancient ones is way down the side. Well, Merida is that too. This is the Casa del Sol. Actually, it's a house about 3 houses down as you move out. It used to have palm trees behind it. That was my subject matter. The house is still there. And another version in color. So I developed a new printmaking process based on, we're using a style of plasticine, pushing things in, and then creating a plate using bond or what we use for repairing cars. Okay, bond or resinado plastic. And so, but it was very tedious to print, so I never did a whole lot of additions. I decided to just do a few of the prints, and I moved into a whole new direction, which is just one of a kind. But besides, before I show you go into there, I want to show you a little bit about the Mate Mexican bark paper. It was a pre-Hispanic paper made by the ancient Mexicans. It was done by the Mayan Yucatec. It was done by the Otomis. And on the trip in Mexico City, Callaghan, we visited San Pablito, where they make this paper from bark, from tree bark. And so I learned on that trip in San Pablito from the Xoteco family how to make these sheets of paper from the inner bark of the tree. These are photos from a book. I didn't have a camera at that time, but that's how I learned the technique. And these are some of the tools. And at that time, they were using an ancient process of paper making. It comes from pre-Hispanic times. Paper is still sold, of course. And it still comes from San Pablito, Pueblo. This was 1984. And some of the paintings you've seen that are not quite as common now, but still you see them around, are these amate paintings, but they're usually painted by artists from Guerrero, from 3 communities, and it's a cultural heritage of paper. It's continued on, and so these used to be more common, seeing these kind of artists selling their paintings. And on the right we have an image of an ancient Mayan codex, which is in a way where this is all coming from. Of the 3 Mayan codices that are known today, the Madrid, the Paris, and the German one. Anyway, there's three of them. And that's all. And then there's a Grolier, this is the 4th, that nobody knows exactly what's in it. The rest were burned in 1562 in front of the church in Miami by Fray Diego de Landa. You probably know that story. And so, I do some courses on ancient pre-Hispanic bookmaking, and I talk about these things, and this is when I used to do this and trim the inner bark of the ficus tree in a nursery here. I've since stopped doing that, and now I just use as a substitute that's a renewable resource instead of using trees. But this shows you a little bit of the process of making beating the bark for that paper. And so they had long, like trees that were flattened out, and cut out, and that they would make these, in long pieces. And of course, their books were like 7 meters long, but all folded. That was a codex. And so I also worked in the community of Oshkoshka with Armando Sul, the man here was a teacher, he was a director of the school, and he was part of the Mayan theater group that used to go to the communities. And so I went with his group, and they wanted me to teach them how to make the paper, and I did. And one of the plays they used to do was the burning of the books of money. And they did that actually in front of the church where the books were burned. He did that and invited me and a few other people in the whole community to see that play a long time ago, in the early 90s. And so he also invited me to come to his school where he was a director and teacher and teach the kids how to make the tree. And before that, I'd already taught him and some of the teachers how to make the paper, so they had prepared the pulp, or the strands of, not really pulp, the strands of fibers, they boiled them. And when I got there, they had it ready, because like I say, some of the teachers, I had already taught them how to do this, and then the kids put together beautiful sheets of paper at the school. This is the school in Mani, Dorotea Aranga, bilingual school. So, this brings us to HUUN Handmade Mayan Paper. I work in a few communities. Up in the upper left is Pascual, where I began working in a little town called San Felipe. And these other photos of the early 90s, working with some people that I trained to make paper and to make products too. And a lot of you nowadays know us for going to like Annie show or Kai shows at the Chamber of Commerce, and we also came and we bring our products that we designed and make. My wife and I, Yoli, that's sitting here in the back. And this was one of the Annie shows. Before we now call ourselves Kai at the Chamber of Commerce, and many of you know about the shows. So that's kind of brings us up to that, one thing as to the other. And so we actually still make products and quite active with that. But at the same time, I want you to know that we have gone to visit, like this group is a family that had a cultural center in Oaxaca. Jesus Salinas Pedraza is a writer of the Yanu, his indigenous language, Yanu and Otomi language. And I met him in Mexico City, and we became friends. And my wife and I went to they have a whole group of writers in Oaxaca in a center. And so what they do is they write books in different languages and translate them into Spanish or whatever. So what we did is we taught them how to make paper and how to print on that paper to make their own handmade books in Oaxaca. And so just a little brief talk about a few Latin American paperwork artists. Some of you have heard about Francisco Toledo, also from Oaxaca. He was a great artist, kind of like the Picasso of all areas. And he was fantastic. He left us a few years ago, but he did amazing things in Oaxaca, invested most of the money he made in his culture and his people, and did wonderful things. So these are pieces he did in handmade paper. That's basically why I'm showing you. Carlos Merida was originally from Guatemala, but he also came to Mexico and lived here, and did a lot of work in handmade paper. Francisco Zúñiga, also from Oaxaca, did beautiful work on handmade paper. Most of this was amate paper from inner bark of the ficus tree. Now, few of you have ever heard of Michael Ponce de Leon, but he's from Merida. He was from Merida, I know from a book. And he moved to the U.S. at some point and did incredible work, but not very Mexican, very U.S. But he did high relief work in paper. And this was the kind of work that inspired me, because he developed a machine that has 60 tons of pressure, and he would develop plates of relief and make thick paper of cotton, like an inch thick, and print these amazing prints that were quite well known in the realm of the United States, in Washington. Juan Manuel de la Rosa was probably the most important. He also passed away last year. A good friend of mine, a paper maker. He was the pioneer in paper making in Mexico, and very famous, not only in paper making but in painting. But he ended up going back to Zacatecas. He'd been in Mexico City. This was his paper making workshop in Mexico City, and fortunately it burned down at some point and didn't make paper after that. But it was really nice. And this is one of his pieces. But there is a lot of information on all of those. Another buddy of mine is Noboru Yurugi, a Japanese married with a Mexican woman. They're in Mexico City, and I've gotten him to show the Makai once. He was one of the show. Fantastic work, all on paper. And you know, the Japanese, the ancient philosophy of Japanese is Shintoist before Buddhist, and it has a close relationship with paper and nature. And so the Japanese are just, you know, really connected with paper. And so this is just one example of his stuff. It's little cubes of paper made out of our HUUN paper, what we produce, and I find them quite fascinating. You can open them up and close them, and that's the Noboru Yurugi. He comes here quite a bit. This is Stephanie Shikora, and you may know her. She's been in Yucatan for many years now, probably about 30 years. And she's originally from Germany and does wonderful work, and she likes to work with our paper. This is done on HUUN paper also, the paper we make. And this is some of my own work done in Amati paper and combined with another cotton paper. And this is where I start taking off into using coral shells and different kinds of textures. And I start using stamps too to create textures that I can control and paint. And these are one-of-a-kind pieces. This is Alma Citlali Vázquez, and she is now showing at the Museo de la Ciudad. And these pieces are all on HUUN paper. That's the main reason I'm showing. They're beautiful pieces. Her parents are Abel and Melda, and the Nahuatl Gallery here on 60th Street. They're wonderful artists, and she's quite promising, their daughter, quite promising artist. And these are 24 liner cuts that I have yet to go down to see at the Museo de la Ciudad. It just opened up about a week ago. I took this off of Facebook. I haven't even been able to talk to her yet. But, I mean, she's been to buy the paper with her father before and stuff. And I've been friends with her. So I'm quite excited about that. You know, and they're beautiful pieces, very much. And so this was just a quick vision of having meetings with other paper makers from Latin America, and you know, and it was interesting. I was in Puerto Rico in 1994. Very interesting to come together, and there's other groups too that I've been involved with. And so this is just a quick thing about pre-Hispanic printmaking, because as a printmaker, in etching, lithography, and lino cuts, I became attracted to the pre-Hispanic stamps that the ancient Mexicans made out of clay and out of stone, and that became, you know, to me, something I wanted to integrate into my work, but I wanted to make my own stamps. So I studied the way they made their stamps, and this is from the Museo de los Sellos de Guanajuato City. Some of these are also from Palacio Canton, the Museum of Anthropology here. They had a show. So it's a mixture of both places, because they were on loan from the Museo de Sellos de Guanajuato. The theory of the use of the stamps is varied, that they use them to print. They use them mostly, the strongest theory is that they printed on human bodies for magical, ceremonial, religious purposes. But they're full of symbolism, and I have a personal theory that they were used to paint on the bodies, and it had applied healing purposes also. And I will attempt to do more work on that in the future to see, at least express that idea. So they're fascinating stamps if you've never seen them. There's a few in the Museo Maya, and there's a few in the Palacio Cartón, the old museum too. So, as I say, this is the Museum of Guanajuato. I became quite inspired by these stamps, clay, stone, and ceramic. And this takes us to the studio here, the second room. This is where I had my studio when I began doing some of these paintings. And it was between 82 and 84, 82 and 85. Before Alonso, Victor, and I left the studio to go to the New Bellas Artes School because, well, it had opened up and they'd asked us to teach there. I went and founded Silkscreen, and Victor founded photography, and Alonso became coordinator of fine arts. And so we left this, and at some point, it became the Merida side. And this, where I was there, right next to this wall here, I had where I taught silkscreen, but I also did some of my stamps pounding into paper. So that was right next to where I was. So these are some of those pieces that were coming off of there, and in that time. This is inspired by the volcano Chichonal back there in Chiapas. It spread a lot of dust, even came to Yucatan. We had dust everywhere, or ashes spread everywhere. And we started seeing the equinox of Chibichaltún in the early 80s. So I got some inspiration from that. The temple of seven dolls I did. And just playing with shape and form. Texture, lots of texture. And pretty much using acrylics. This is based on a comet that was going by, I think it was Boitec or something. Yeah. That's when the first conventions of archaeoastronomy began, and that was the first one was in Merida, was in Chibichaltún, the archaeoastronomy. I don't remember the time. Maybe. So these are some of those pieces, and I began looking at certain symbols of pre-Hispanic culture, and working with Broom Serpent and legend and mythology. And also working with, like, we have the case of the Mayan turtle actor, and playing with movement, texture of the water, or also work with some of the architecture again with the like Izamal. I had a friend who was an anthropologist who wanted for me to do a painting based on the Virgin of Izamal and the relationship with the ancient Mayan culture that had been there, that was more related to Chak, and these symbols were embedded within the church still, the grain god Chak. And so I began doing a series of compositions based on the two, the colonial aspect of architecture and the Virgin of Izamal and symbolism of the Mayans in that area. Chahao or something, the sun god was Samna. Huh? Samna. Yeah, Samna, that's right. So there are symbols of Samna. And more and more playing with color, dark and light, and symbols. Using a lot of organic shape and form and textures. Mayan symbol of the Lucius on a serpent down below. It comes from I would take, like from a codex and find something that was attractive, like this little serpent with little aluches or like leprechauns on top of it, and find that very interesting to put it into a composition of water and waves. Just playing with form and shape. And playing with architecture and the Mayan type of architecture. And actually going more abstract to this, to the terrestrial architecture with coral and shape and some Mayan architecture combined, much more abstract than the rest. And then moving toward some few pieces of relief sculpture paper. And instead of pounding stamps into these, which I was in before, this is cast paper into molds. This was actually commissioned from a biblioteco that's quite a collector, Jose Enrique Gutierrez Lopez, which is also got a bit he's a notary and up here on 62nd Street or something. But he wanted me to do a painting with Italia. So I didn't even know much about it. I knew about the fruit, but anyway, I did research on it, and this was like the piece was quite a large piece on paper, and it was mostly cotton and sisal fiber at that time. And, so this was before I painted it, but I had some people wanted the white piece later. In Florida, there was a woman that collected the bought a piece of white, but he bought the piece that looked like this. That the original pitaya comes in magenta or yellow. Some people have seen the fruit in yellow. And so this was the way the pitaya grows on an albarrada stone wall, and it has a lot of the symbols of the morning star. It's kind of a morning star because I actually discovered my first pitaya flower as I was doing a very early morning walk. And you can only see a flower at night or in the morning before the sun hits it. They're about this big. So if you ever get an opportunity to see pitaya flower, it's a beautiful subject. And so I was quite inspired by this when I found my first pitaya. But to do this piece is not easy. So I'm going to show you just one example of working on the plasticine with the stones, using real stones to get the texture of the stone wall. Is the way you do it. You have to stand on the stone to get to put it in there. And so in the end, this is the texture I got out of plasticine. Quite a lot of work to get the texture. And then you pour plaster in to create a positive, and then rework the positive, and do another mold from that, but I'm not going to show you. And then you've seen the original already. During that time, I was invited to the Sterling Signatures and Gallery in Miami through my friend Bruce Hanners that was living there at the time. I was doing some projects with him in Miami. We were both showing there. And so these are some of the pieces I showed there. And then I was invited to do this piece, which was a very large piece. This is about, 2.2 meters tall. And this was a piece out of fiberglass. I couldn't make it out of paper. It was too big. It was a commissioned piece for a very large house here in Miami. It's called the Four Elements: fire, wind, water, and earth. And so the way I did this again was the plasticine, a large piece. I carved it. Instead of doing all the back and forth stuff, I decided that's too much. Doing the negative and then mold and then another mold. So I asked the guys that